So aside from you living at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, in 4 years, what's the one thing that you hope you will have accomplished?
In 4 years,
Yeah, what thing for America would you hope the most from your candidacy?
I would have galvanized public sentiment around a priority list of measures to combat climate change and begun the implementation of them. All the while dramatically expanding the skills training and the kind of experiential training necessary to address many of these would have to be new, innovative solutions. I mean, I would try to avoid one thing you do in 4 years because I think this is a unique time in history where you really have three things that have to be done.
Okay, so the three are...
So climate change is one.
Yeah.
Universal healthcare, but really addressing the inflation of healthcare would be the second. And then the third is this incredibly looming risk of automation and artificial intelligence. Again, not eliminate, and they're going to eliminate professions. I moved to Colorado in '86 as a geologist. I thought I'd be a geologist my whole life. I got moved out there in '81, got laid off in '86, and I was out of work for 2 years. I mean, 10,000 geologists got laid off in that period of time. So I lost not just my job and my profession, and that is a much harder thing to do. And when you've been out of work for 6 months, 8 months, 10 months, you see a different person in the mirror. We're going to see that with the workplace disruption from automation and artificial intelligence. We're going to have boatloads of jobs, but we don't have a system set in place now to provide the skills training and the tools that people can. I mean, all those robots are going to need technicians to reboot them. They're going to need people to operate them. So that's a big part of what I've spent the last 5 or 6 years in Colorado doing is building the foundation for what that would look like. So in the same way that we got to near universal health care in Colorado, and I think build a platform for how to address healthcare and also medical inflation. I think that the skills training has to be the same kind of a springboard forward. So those would be the three things. If I had the freedom to let reality define the questions rather than the power of the media.
All right. Well, so I'm sure you saw, this week with President Trump going after the four freshman congresswomen. So just kind of very, a little more broadly, I guess, how do you view race relations in this country and a big critique of the Democratic field from the right and a bit from the center has been about so-called identity politics. Where do you stand on kind of where this country needs to go in terms of racial equality and, that kind of general question looming over the Democratic Party?
Sure. So, slavery really didn't end at the end of the Civil War. It evolved. You go to Jim Crow, forced convict labor in the late 1800s throughout most of the South, where they'd arrest black teenagers often for petty crimes and give them 6 months or a year, and they'd have to work out in the fields without pay. Different type of slavery. You evolved into lynchings, legalized terrorism. If you get a chance to go down to Montgomery and see the Peace and Justice Museum and the Memorial for Peace and Justice, it recounts. They've now got to 4,300, I think, lynchings where they can document from at least two sources that it really happened. And these were advertised in our newspapers. I mean, it was a form of terrorism without question. And then most people would say that the war on drugs, the continued segregation and resegregation of our education systems. I mean, the way I usually think about it is that slavery is the nagging, persistent shame of America that even to this day denies the promise of our country to too many of our citizens. And I don't think we're ever going to really own it until, well, the first way to own to really get past it is to own it, and to own it we need an apology, and I think the apology should come from the Oval Office of the White House. I apologized, gave a formal apology on the 150th anniversary of the Sand Creek Massacre, one of the worst Native American massacres, which was carried out by the first volunteers of Colorado. And we brought the Cheyenne, Arapaho, the descendants of the victims together over a period of, I think it was 18 months, almost 2 years, and really tried to make sure we heard what it meant. We also used that, so we commemorated the site. It's now a national. Ken Salazar helped us make it a national part of the national park system. It's a national memorial. But we also use that to use our Office of Indian Affairs to go around to all the public high schools and junior high schools and middle schools in Colorado and address, I think at that time there were still 34 different teams that had names that were the Savages or the Redskins or names that many Native Americans felt were pejorative. And we actually went, my head of Indian Affairs was a Ute Mountain Ute, would go to and talk to the kids on the teams and tell them how it made him feel. And he had some young Ute teenagers as well. And we were able to, I think we've gotten now to all the teams but 2 have voluntarily changed their names by talking with the kids after that apology.
So in both these realms, do you think something like reparations would be appropriate?
But I think that there's a bill before in Congress now that would study that, and I think we certainly should look at studying it. It's a large, complex issue to kind of give a yes or no on. But I do think that, I think the diversity that we have in this country is one of our greatest strengths. I think the diversity in the Democratic Party is one of our greatest strengths. So you're not going to hear me attack identity politics. I do think that bringing people back together is a crucial part of what the country's going to need to do, and it's a big part of what we've lost, right? I think we're in a national crisis of division. It sounds like a cliche, but we probably have to go all the way back to the Civil War to find a time when we were this divided, and the challenges we face are as threatening as was the Civil War, right? The Civil War was almost twice as many people died in the Civil War as died in World War II from the American standpoint. The divisions we face and the threats we face, from climate change to automation, the incredible inflation of healthcare, the inequality of income now, each of these things is going to require us to come back together again. I think part of reason I'm running for president is again and again and again in Colorado we've been able to bring people together who don't like each other and are able to get them to work together and actually create meaningful outcomes, collaborations and compromises that generate real progress. And I think that's part of how what we as Democrats have to look at is how do we bring ourselves back together.
But just to get there, do you think that it's appropriate to call some of the president's actions, like this tweet or the Charlottesville remarks, is it appropriate to call that racist? Is it appropriate to say that the president is a racist?
Certainly many of the things that the president says are racist. I don't know how anybody can argue against that. But I'm not going to let myself, because all he wants is for someone to call him a racist. All he wants is to get into attack and compel otherwise diligent, responsible newspapers to continue to give him an excess of attention. Mm-hmm. And he's willing to take his chances that he can translate that attention into votes. And it is I think it's a cruel, cynical form of politics. It's the opposite of everything. I mean, the reason I got into politics is the essential opposite of why I got into politics. So I try to keep my keep my space from that.
So the opioid crisis is an issue of much concern even in this quaint region. And
Sure.
most all the candidates have a plan which calls for appropriating money to help deal with that crisis. To your view, what's the best use of new money spent to battle that scourge?
Sure. I mean, the opioid crisis is one of the most significant medical crises we've had, partly because people refused to talk about it for so long, for a number of years. I remember when Peter Shumlin was governor of Vermont, he made his State of the State speech and everyone was shocked. But even by that point, I mean, that whole herd of horses was out of the barn. I first got elected governor in 2010, took office in 2011. At the end of 2011, agreed to chair a task force impaneled by the National Governors Association. Myself and Governor Bentley from Alabama chaired it, to look at what are the appropriate responses. And I think the best practices we've developed then have been modified somewhat, but are still essential now. So you need to make sure that we have widespread acknowledgement of what's going on and willingness to talk about it. Obviously, a lot of it's a mental health issue is driving some of this, and within people's families and between people and their doctors, they've got to talk about it. We have put in a SIM system in Colorado so that, and we're still working on the innovations, but when you go to your I call your medical home, and go to your family doctor, they will check and they ask you, how is everything? How's your life going? Everything seems to be okay? And begin to assess whether there's some mental health issues within your family, and if there is, make it free to talk about it. More specifically, getting beyond mental health back to opioids, we created a whole template of things you need to do. First and foremost, get your pharmacies, and not just the big chains like Walmart and what? CVS. I'm mildly dyslexic, so it's really hard on those things. But basically have a single database, so that if someone's kiting prescriptions, in other words, taking the same prescription and filling it at store after store, you know about it immediately, and that drugstore faces penalties. You also need to make sure that people take responsibility for what's in their medicine cabinet. To this day, I cannot believe I got a dental implant in 2006 and another one in 2008. And each time they gave me 30 days worth of Percocet. One was Percocet, one was Vicodin. And then they said, if you still feel pain in 3 days, please call me. I mean, so the pain's supposed to be gone in 3 days, but you give me 30 days of this narcotic. No wonder we've got problems, right? Clearly, those are sales that are being driven by a sales program, not by a medical solution. And certainly, the sales teams of those pharmaceutical companies had underplayed the potential risk of overconsumption of these pharmaceuticals. And I had a friend who became addicted to Percocet in 1981, 1982. In other words, you could still get these drugs. It was much, much harder to get the drugs until the manufacturers went out on this. So the second thing is to make sure people are aware and take responsibility for what's in their medicine cabinet, but we give them safe places to dispose of them. You are absolutely not supposed to put them down in the toilet. In other words, you've got to make sure people understand and we would do a day every 3 months, and it would be at all the local hospitals and clinics, community health centers, where you can dispose of these pharmaceuticals. Obviously, things like naloxone and people that help. The ability to save lives when people have drug overdoses have to be widely available, and first responders, and make sure that the training is there to support that. And we also have to step back and look at addressing the prescriptions that the doctors write. And so, just as I said, they were giving 30 days where you're only going to have 3 or 4 days of pain. So we got variations within our Medicaid, so the poor people wouldn't be able to prescribe more than 7 days of pain medication without a clear exception from the doctor saying this is ongoing chronic pain that deserves this. And then even as general medical advice to doctors. they're very particular about how much you limit their freedom to do what they need to do. But we got them to restrict their, and make it as the commonplace prescription would be 7 days, not 30 days. So that, I mean, I can go down the list. I can get deeper in the weeds because it's a whole set of protocols, right? And largely these are to try to deal with making sure that we catch it early. Again, opioids, once you get by a certain point, it becomes incredibly difficult and incredibly expensive. It's an interesting thing that states with legalized marijuana have, I don't know, you're probably going to have a marijuana question here in a second. Maybe I'll wait until you get to the question, but in Colorado, we do a public health survey of 24,000 people every 2 years. Wildly expensive. Big deal. But it has allowed us to have a baseline and to measure the consequences of legalized marijuana on a recreational basis, and we have seen no spike in teenage consumption. Zero. Saw a little go up in the beginning, then it came right back down. We've seen no spike in any demographic except seniors. And we believe it is an alternative pain medication for seniors as a way of avoiding the risks of opioids. And a wise alternative it is.
You touched on mental health, which is certainly a component of this issue. What to your view, is the path forward to dealing with the increase that we're seeing in the uptick in the suicide rate on a national level?
So we've, I'm sure everyone knows people who've committed suicide, but we put a lot of effort into trying to figure out what is at the core of it. And again, looking at surveys, polls, focus groups. And it's hard. The closest thing I can find is that we are dealing with a persistent level of despair, that people don't believe in their future. If you're going to ask me one of the major challenges America faces, that's perhaps one of the most significant. And I can get you, I have it written down somewhere, the Gallup quite recently said, for the first time in American history, a majority of Americans don't think they're going to be better off in 10 years than they are today. This country has always had a positive, optimistic, forward-looking approach. And that despair is obviously based on people's success at finding jobs. The government malpractice that occurred in the 1980s and 1990s when people got laid off like I was, that they lost not just their job but their profession, and the government did nothing to help them find a new profession or get restarted. They just assumed they weren't capable of learning the operating computers. I mean, it's so funny, you go down to rural Michigan or rural Wisconsin, everybody's got an iPhone. Everybody can, I mean, this thing is 20 times more powerful than any computer anybody had in 1985. And everybody can operate it, right? We could have trained people to redo those jobs. And I think that despair has only gotten worse. And I think that's, driving a significant part of the suicides we say. But there are a lot of other indicators, and there's, as we've become more affluent, the families have, we no longer have nuclear families at the same rate, and this is across pretty much all parts of society. We see this in Germany and France, all in most of the industrialized nations, and there's some sense that creates, some social scientists believe that creates a foundation for despair. And I don't think we don't know.
Is mental health parity in insurance, is that part of the equation, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a necessary step, but I don't think it's our greatest success in terms of how to address mental health. I spent a lot of time, when I was a student at Wesleyan, there's a community health center on North Main Street in Middletown that I helped start back in
Mark Maselli?
Yeah, you know Mark Maselli?
I did 2 profiles on him.
Oh, you poor soul. For the Argus, no doubt. So I helped Mark Maselli start the community health center. I actually have there's a letter somewhere, I've got a copy, in 1978, I wrote a letter to the Middletown Press saying that healthcare is a right, not a privilege. And, you know, I think I tease, this is just a joke, but I tease when Elizabeth Warren was still a Republican. I was saying that healthcare was a right, not a privilege, because I have great admiration for Senator Warren. But the community health center, part of what their approach was to try to address mental health, to use the community health center on a sliding scale to provide universal coverage. And Mark and I adopted a couple of kids, several kids who had serious mental health issues. One young man, Paul Mortensen, who we'd all try and find jobs for him, paint our house, paint our rooms, you know, do whatever. But he was an alcoholic, a periodic drug addict. He ended up being so drunk one day he walked off into the Connecticut River and drowned. But we tried everything. And we are still, you know, even in terms of using these strange combos of different pharmaceuticals, our understanding is still, I think, at the initial level in terms of really dealing with serious mental health issues.
I'm gonna shift gears from that. You mentioned rural Wisconsin, rural Michigan.
Uh-huh.
We're a fairly rural area
You're not kidding.
here.
That's why I love it so much.
So you have a plan to help rural areas, I think it says leverage their unique competitive advantages. What are those unique competitive advantages?
So, and I mean, again, I would argue that this is true of almost everything we're talking about, but I think I'm the only candidate running who's actually done what everybody else is talking about. In other words, we created rural economic development at scale in Colorado. And, you know, we provided tax incentives. So if you are a small business owner or an entrepreneur and you start a business in rural Colorado, for the first 4 years of that business, you pay no state tax of any kind to Colorado. And your employees pay no state tax. We went and persuaded the urban and suburban citizens of Colorado that they could afford to pay I think it's $1.09. I should really look this up and get the real number. But a tax on their cell phone bill to make sure that we have broadband in every single city and town. So we will, by the end of next year, have broadband in every city and town in Colorado. We'll be the first state in the country to do that. And again, that's the ante, to sit at the table, you know, to get, you, as they say at the World Poker Championships, you need a seat and a chip, and then you can go to work.
So you do that through the telecoms? Like their billings, people, and you're adding that
Yes.
to the bill?
So it's a very, and I've been very blunt in telling citizens, you're paying $1 a month to make sure that our rural economy is resilient and sustainable, and that we have a long-term sustainable source of food within our own boundaries. And I've never had anyone complain, not one. So we've also looked at using culture. I mean, here's the bottom line. And there's this weird word, which my staff says I should never use anymore, but I use it every once in a while. It's an SAT word, but it's a word called topophilia. And topophilia means love of place. And what we're talking about, if you want to bring rural America back, go walk in any town. I walked over 100 downtowns when I was expanding my brew pub company, looking for locations. And so I'd go and spend a weekend in Shreveport and Akron, Ohio, and I mean, I opened a brew pub in Rapid City, South Dakota, Wheeling, West Virginia. I was captivated by this notion of trying to create opportunity in places where it hadn't existed for a long time. And everywhere you see a park, a library, a bench, you see material representations of how much people loved their community and that they took their money and put it towards public improvements, public infrastructure that was meaningful to them at that time. What we tried to do in Denver when I became mayor was, again, you have to have good schools. You have to have, I think, universal health care coverage, or as close as you can get to it. But you also need to fuel people's affection for where they live. People, there are a number of evolutionary scientists who believe that we are genetically disposed to love where we are. It's weird that those humans that paid attention to their surroundings and appreciate their surroundings in time of a famine or a drought would know where the last little bit of water was, know where the hidden berries were, because they paid attention, and they would be preferentially more likely to make it through to the next drought or the next famine. So we need to take that natural affection and expand it. So in Colorado now we have 1,000 miles of bike trails. We have more live music venues in Austin or Austin, Texas, or Nashville, Tennessee. We wanted to make sure that we did everything we could to attract young people back, and young people like arts, right? They like music, they like theater, they like writers and painting. And I think that's a big part of why, if you go look at Denver, what's happened in Denver over the last 16 years, it's probably I would argue, one of the 2 or 3 most talked about cities in America right now for young people where they want to live. I don't have a poll on that, but I can tell you, I'm pretty sure it's true. And, I'm friends with the CEO of Gallup, so I consistently weasel special information from him, which I always have a permission to share. But there's I can't remember, I think it's 24% of the people that live in cities and suburbs would prefer to live in a smaller town. So if we can invest the infrastructure to make it attractive for young people to come back, if we can give tax incentives and push jobs out there, and I've talked to the CEO of Workday. So Workday is a large company in Silicon Valley that has offices all over the country now. I don't know how many employees they've got, like 20,000 employees. But he's doing research for it to see what kind of incentives would he need to open offices, and how big would that office have to be efficient for him as a business. 500 people, 1,000 people, 250 people, and how small a town can they successfully put a network of tech offices together, since so many people can work remotely. And what he has told me on a preliminary basis is he'll work out some of the efficiency details, but the most important incentive that you can give to tech companies to expand into rural America is train workers. In other words, use community colleges, technical schools, private college, whatever, to make sure they don't have to be electrical engineers, but there's got to be a source of people that can do the jobs that they are going to be creating. And if you do that, they're willing to be part of that solution. So you create the love of place, you give some tax incentives, and then you go out and start recruiting businesses that have an inclination to be successful in rural areas.
So you mentioned broadband as one. Aside from that, in terms of infrastructure, what would your priorities be? You had a $1 trillion, I think, infrastructure proposal.
Yeah, although it's not all federal government. In other words, I've tried to be very wise on my expenditures and balance sheet. In other words, I think I'm the only person running who has balanced 16 consecutive budgets, 8 years as mayor, 8 years as a governor. I have to go back and check on that to make sure somebody hasn't. But $1 trillion, a huge part of that comes from local investment. So if you look at what we did in fast tracks, fast tracks, let me just take one digression. Is that right?
Yeah.
When I ran for mayor, the suburbs hated the city of Denver. Denver was liberal. Denver had senior water rights. Denver had the vast majority of tax base, commercial tax base. And Denver had always thumbed their nose at the suburbs. And I said that was crazy. I ran on the basis I'd replace the fundamental nonsense of government with common sense. I would I would not attack my opponents so as to get on TV and get notoriety and get celebrity. I was going to create a positive picture of what things could look like and work my way into celebrity and notoriety. And then the last thing I was going to do, I said Denver would never be a great city without great suburbs. And we would share even our precious senior water rights. If Aurora or one of the other suburbs ran out of water and had to suspend building permits, it would affect the value of every home in Denver. All the pundits, every political advisor told me, well, don't waste your time. You have no way of winning you're telling the voters who you want to elect you, the voters of Denver, that you're going to share their most precious treasures with the suburbs, the people they hate the most. And I was running against, 8 other candidates, 5 of them lifetime public servants, very talented. I got 65% of the vote. Because actually the people of Denver didn't hate the suburbs. The politicians who benefit from having an enemy, if you get into a fight politically, you're in the newspaper, you're on TV. I got 65% of the vote because people were fed up with the old system. And I immediately went to the suburban mayors and said, we all have congestion. We're all using the same infrastructure. Why don't we take this, it's been talked about, but let's really come together around fast tracks, 122 miles of new light rail track, most ambitious transit initiative of modern American history, and let's do it together. And it took about a year and a half, a lot of talking. I went to their offices. I let them be the alpha dog. I let them yell at me. I did everything I could to build that initial bit of trust. And a lot of it's, when they're angry at you, you repeat, you learn this in the bar business, you repeat back and say their exact words back to them, and they feel, validated, and you hear the words in a different way when you say it. Anyway, we went to the ballot with 34 mayors, 21 of them either Republicans or conservative independents, unanimously supporting a 0.4% sales tax increase to build this transit initiative. No one's ever done that in the history of the country. And if you fly into Denver now, you can take light rail right from the airport into downtown and Union Station. The stations, you're in the center of a national model for urban revitalization. And we did it by bringing everybody together. So the answer to your question about infrastructure, which is it? I think it's what you can bring people together around. And so each community, some communities it's going to be a bridge, sometimes it's going to be roads and some other form of transportation infrastructure. Sometimes it's going to be broadband would be one of my highest priorities for the whole country, because I think we do have to bring the rural part of the country back into the embrace of the urban areas and vice versa. So I don't think you want to have a checklist or a laundry list to list them out, but the key is you've got to look for, when I was in private business and also in government, real change occurs, real success arrives when you have the alignment of self-interest. And sometimes you just have to keep talking to people and show them that little narrow part of the pie shape that they thought was their success, maybe there are a whole broader pie shape of different outcomes where it wouldn't be perfect for them, but they'd still be much better off. And that's when you get overlapping and alignment of self-interest.
A self-interest problem. So on climate change, we just kind of, I know you probably asked a lot about fracking, but we just kind of want to know where you're at on 3 things. So one is just what kind of public resources you want to dedicate towards mitigating the effects of climate change. Is there a place for natural gas and things like that in a climate change proposal? And what kind of autonomy or ability to object to initiatives would local municipalities and states have under a potential Hickenlooper administration?
That's a lot of questions. He did go to Wesleyan. First, just to start from the beginning, I think I'm the only professional geologist in the history of America to have a master's in geology. I know I'm the only brewer since 1791, since Sam Adams, to become a governor. I think my geological background gives me a unique perspective on just how urgent the situation is. And everyone talks about it. But I think understanding the science and recognizing that as the permafrost thaws more rapidly than anyone had thought, there's a level of methane tied up in that permafrost that was not in any of the earlier models before several years ago. Or it was in there, but it was on a very, very slow, modified release. I felt from the moment I became mayor, and we had an initiative over 20 years to plant 1 million trees on the south side of homes, over streets where people get in their cars. Trees not only take the carbon dioxide out of the air, but they dramatically reduce the demands on electricity for air conditioning. We did all these things that were, I think, ahead of their time to a certain extent. And when I became governor, I did the same thing. There's a guy named Fred Krupp, who's the CEO of the Environmental Defense Fund. And I saw him in Davos in 2011, I think, or maybe it was 2012. But it was 2012, and I'd just taken office. I'd been in office a year. And he said, what are you going to do about fugitive emissions? I didn't even know what fugitive emissions were. And fugitive emissions being all the methane and other gases that are released in the general operating process of natural gas or oil and gas. And I said, well, I just got elected, but we're one of the top 5 or 6 states in oil and gas. Colorado has a lot of activity. Let me see, but I'm not going to begin right now. I'm just getting to know the leadership of the industry. Fast forward 3 months later, and I'm working on trying to convince the oil and gas industry that they should reveal the ingredients of fracking fluid. And they are saying it's intellectual property. I'm saying, well, but look at a bottle of Coca-Cola, most important intellectual property is that formula, and yet they list the ingredients on the label. So we're getting this battle, and I was making some progress. And Fred Krupp had reached out to me about a month before reminding me about fugitive emissions. And so we're about to take a break on the ingredients of fracking fluid. And I said, as we were getting up to take a 5 or 10 minute break, I said, well, at some point you guys are going to have to come to the table over fugitive emissions. And one of the CEOs looked at me and said, well, we do that, except your buddies in the environmental community would lard it up with a bunch of red tape. We'd spend millions of dollars that really wouldn't do any good, and we'd get no credit anyway. I said, is that the issue? I mean, that's what's blocking? And so we talked for another 5 or 10 minutes. Then we took the break. I immediately went out and called Fred Krupp. I said, hey, would you let me create a lean set of regulations? Would you, make sure every dollar counts? And would you make sure we shared the credit? And he laughed and go, of course. So I came back into the room, and we were talking about the ingredients of fracking fluid, and the head of I guess there were 3 CEOs in the room. One of them was a service company, and they had created they had a transparent plastic 1 liter, slightly larger than this, clear, just like this transparent liquid that he said, and it's like syrup. And he said, this is a prototype. We can't sell this, it's too expensive. But it's a prototype of frac fluid that would have no environmental concerns at all, because every ingredient has been FDA approved. Food and Drug Administration, it's food quality ingredients. It's what they use to make frozen food or whatever. He goes, you could drink this. And I looked at him and I said, you could drink this. And he kind of laughed, and he took it, and just took a sip. And then he put it down in front of me. And I had this moment where if I was going to get ingredients of frac fluid, either they were going to trust me or they weren't. And so I figured if he drank it, it couldn't be too bad. So I took a sip. And we got back, and in 72 hours, we had a rough draft of revealing the ingredients of frac fluid. A week and a half, maybe 2 weeks later, we began talking about methane regulations. And again, methane is 25 to 40 times worse for climate change than CO2. No one has ever regulated it. People have banned oil and gas, but to my knowledge, no one in the world had ever gotten the oil and gas industry to really regulate methane. Certainly no state in the United States had ever done it. And it began, 2 months, and again, the oil and gas industry and the environmental industry have such a long history of deception and betrayal. They hate each other. It's worse than Coke and Pepsi. And anyway, so we began this 2-month of negotiation just on what the scientific literature meant, and then another 12 months on creating methane regulations. But in the end, the oil and gas industry put up the $60 million to implement these regulations. It's equivalent, according to the Environmental Defense Fund, of taking 320,000 cars a year off the roads, now being rolled out as national policy across Canada. So my point is, I have a fierce urgency for this, but I also think that we've got to be very honest about getting everyone together. After this election, we're going to need Republicans and Democrats. We can't demonize business and say that they're all evil, that we're going to punish them in some way. And I think we're at a unique moment, because if the Koch brothers, 1 year ago, at their annual retreat at the Broadmoor Hotel, Charles Koch publicly got up and said, Americans for Prosperity will no longer fund climate change deniers. And that was a shock. And now even ExxonMobil, all the major oil companies no longer are in denial. They're perhaps worried about litigation and the consequences of them having science that suggests this is true, and they're saying it's not a problem. But anyway, I think we are at the moment now where after the election, we can come together and deal with the things we know about, right? The transition to electric vehicles. We were able to get 12 states, Western states, Republicans and Democrats, to begin building the infrastructure for along our interstates to create rapid recharging stations for electric vehicles. So it's not a bottleneck as we begin this sudden transformation is going to happen in two or 3 years. And then all the other things, efficiency in buildings, changing our building codes. We know we can do that. We know it pays for itself. Some of the other things where we need innovation, concrete gives off a huge amount of CO2 as it cures. No one talks about it, but if you're gonna rank the CO2 polluters on Earth, China's the worst CO2 polluter. The United States is second. Concrete is third, and no one's spending the time doing the research on how we're going to replace that. Same with agriculture. We've got some enzymes now that some of the scientists at the University of Iowa or Iowa State University and Colorado State University are working on that can be added to the feed corn for cattle that will dramatically reduce, if not eliminate, the methane creation from livestock. I mean, all these things have to be addressed in real time. So, I mean, that's...
Well, yeah, so, like, what kind of buy-in are you kind of imagining? I mean, obviously it's a global issue, and the true beneficiaries of any kind of sacrifices people make are people who aren't even born yet. So I mean I get kind of how you're selling.
Your generation is going to have to pay.
Yeah. Well, that's how I'm asking. I mean, how much money you're willing to spend on things like carbon capture? I mean, a lot of what the Green New Deal gets mocked for on the right are what the people think are just flat out unrealistic things that Americans would give up. So, what kind of buy-in from
like which things are?
You're talking about cows. Obviously, they if you watch Fox News, the top items would be getting rid of hamburger meat, getting rid of airplanes. No, but I mean
that's my point. Is you don't have to get rid of them. My point is there are innovations that we've got to fund the research to make sure that we deliver cost-effective alternatives for concrete, for how we raise livestock, and I have no doubt that we'll be able to do all that.
But does that involve a tax on carbon, or I mean, what kind of skin do the American people have to put in the game to get this stuff done?
I think that and this is you can analyze this yourself. I think what we should do is have a price on carbon. I think there has to be a price on carbon. I like to call it a fee, and then you dividend it back out to the American people, and by doing that, you're not trying to grow government. You're not trying to provide fuel for the deniers to attack our initiatives. Again, I do believe that, and you asked me what in 4 years I'd want to be able to say, I'd want to bring public sentiment together, because right now it's not. It's widely diffused, and that's why I don't think you can, the climate initiative that climate tax that they tried to pass in the state of Washington and went down ignominiously.
Yeah.
Right. It was taking that money and then reusing it for a bunch of government purposes. Americans right now don't trust government. Right. That's why I ran for mayor. I thought I was so shocked as I heard more and more how much people distrusted and disliked government. I said, hey, this is America. They are us, right? If you're unhappy with the city council person, you should run or replace them in Congress, whatever. So anyway, I look at money matters, and I think when you place a price on carbon but re-dividend the money back, what you're going to do is you're going to really push scientific research towards figuring out how do we innovate around livestock or heavy industry and make sure that we are addressing climate change in real time. Right.
Yeah. And this is you've already touched on the emphasis you put on workforce retraining, but kind of tying that to just your views on education more broadly. How do you view public investment? Sorry.
Let me just finish one thing
Sure.
before we switch off, because I can't wait to dive into education. The one other thing about climate change in terms of molding public sentiment is we need better examples that show real time what's happening, and I think. And there are a bunch of scientists doing that work, and they haven't been able to get it to the public window yet. And part of my goal is to make sure that we do that. There's a guy named Michael Greenstone at the University of Chicago. He's actually the Milton Friedman Endowed Chair at the University of Chicago Economics Department. And he can document soybean agriculture. Over the last 50 years, it's been moving north at a consistent rate because it's very temperature sensitive. He says by 2050, you will not grow soybeans. Not only will there be no soybeans in Iowa, there'll be no soybeans in the United States. That's a whole nother state up there. And I think those kinds of examples, when I'm in Iowa and I show someone a map showing these bands of soybean migration to the north, that gets their attention, right? So I just want to make sure that as we do these, create a real business plan for how to address climate change, we're doing so in such a way that brings people together and doesn't drive them apart.
Yeah.
Okay, back to education.
Yeah, so you've talked about, you're big on workforce training. So in education, how much public investment would you want in things like STEM? I mean, a lot of states with their education budgets have been cutting back on, kind of more conventional liberal arts components to try to kind of be, innovative and lean for the future. And on, with workforce retraining, I mean, do you think it works? I mean, I know you guys were on the debate stage together, but a candidate in the field like Andrew Yang, a big component of his campaign is that, with the rise of automation, which you said is a major threat earlier on, that he thinks that workforce retraining isn't a relevant part of that solution because those jobs or the people who are losing these professions don't like these programs and they don't often succeed in them based on the data he cites. So where do you stand on that?
So, well, I like Andrew Yang a lot. I disagree with him on that you can't retrain people to have skills that allow them to do this new generation of jobs. And there's going to be all kinds of new generations of jobs. I also don't agree with him that giving people something for nothing creates joy. I understand that there are some examples in Europe that he uses that claim some level of joy from that approach, but it'll take us a long time to evolve in that direction. We have an apprenticeship program in Colorado called CareerWise to try and expose kids when they're in high school to the types of skills that will give them choices throughout their lives, give them real careers. And having some ability to understand technology and coding, how that works, it's pretty basic. It's pretty essential. To deny that people are willing to learn that, I've seen some of the studies, and I question. To me, it's the same kind of frustrating government inaction that we saw in the 80s and the 90s when people were not given a chance to be retrained for the new industries that were coming out even then. So, to cut to the chase, our apprenticeship takes kids when they're 16, going into their sophomore year. The first year they work 2 days a week, and then they go back to a community college or their high school, and they study things that will make them more successful. So they can work in a bank or an insurance company. They can work in advanced manufacturing in a hospital, and they'll learn skills that will make them more successful. The second year, instead of working 2 days, they'll work 3 days, and the third year they'll work 4 or 5 days. At the end of their 3-year apprenticeship, they'll have been paid roughly $30,000, and most of them live at home, so they're saving it. We're in our third year of pilots right now. They will have if they choose to go to college, they will have a year's worth of college credit with no debt. Although, as I think it's worth always reminding everyone that for the last 40 years, 65 to 70% of our kids never get a 4-year degree. That's been plus or minus 5% consistent for almost 40 years. 65 to 70% of our kids don't get a 4-year degree, and we basically told them that they're second-class citizens. So an apprenticeship program allows, by the time I finished my first term as president, I'd want to have 1 million apprentices a year going out into the world. And this is what variations of this are what Switzerland and Sweden and New Zealand, even Australia use to great success. You also need to go.
Can I just ask, is this a program you would mandate from the federal level on the states? And if so, how would you pay for it?
So this and again, everything I've done in Colorado, and I think almost everything I've done in Colorado, is a template for what could be done nationally. And cost matters. I am inherently an entrepreneur. Wait.
But does the state have to do this?
No, of course not.
Okay.
States are the laboratories of democracy, but states aren't fools. And when they see something, right now there are 26 other states copying this apprenticeship program, right? Because they can clearly see it's working, and the numbers are as obvious as the fingers on my hand. We've been leaving these kids behind, and this is a way you can actually give them real choices and real opportunities. And the ability to pay for it, essentially, if you think about it, the businesses are taking, we've been paying for high school for these kids all the way through their senior year. Now all of a sudden they're not going to high school anymore. They're coming, and 2/5, 2 days out of 5, instead of going to school, they're working in a business and getting paid. And the business is actually helping train them for life. The second year, they're going to work 3 days. So the business is actually helping to educate them. They're in essence voluntarily paying more taxes. We're not paying the businesses, right? We've talked about giving them $1,000 tax credits, but so far we haven't needed to because they are in line to get as many of these apprenticeships as they can because they make sense. And the last year, they're working 4 or 5 days because it's a bargain. They're paying them $15 an hour, but by this time, they understand the way the company works and how to be effective, and they're actually doing things that are meaningful, and the company views them as long-time future investments, which is key. So this takes almost, I think the amount we put into this thing to do it nationally, assuming all 50 states wanted it, was $3 or $4 billion a year. I mean, a lot of money, but for what it does to the country, it's a pittance because businesses are voluntarily paying more taxes by taking over a certain amount of responsibility. And that we share that savings with the public schools, and they use it as a way to pay their teachers a little more, which pretty much in every state in the country is something that people are agitating for relentlessly.
Yeah.
So anyway, the other thing I want to make just so that the apprenticeship starts it, but we also need skills training for people of all ages. And so we started a partnership with LinkedIn. Microsoft bought LinkedIn now. Microsoft is the partner in this. They gave us a grant a year and a half ago of $26 million, the largest grant from the Microsoft Foundation in history, to create something called skillful.com that will allow kids over the course of their life to accumulate a profile of skills. And at any time they can click on a different profession and see which skills they have are relevant to that profession, which skills they're missing, where they can get those skills, what it'll cost. And Walmart is leaning in on this. Obviously, Amazon just announced a large program of reskilling their employees. Starbucks has a big program for reskilling. Most of the major companies realize that everyone's going to have to learn new skills constantly all the time, and that the businesses have a responsibility to be part of that. And again, this is something we're not funding with state dollars, right? We're trying to create the synergy between what our citizens need and what our businesses need, and make sure that we're helping to find a solution and helping those good innovations grow to scale.
So somewhat to what Jake originally asked about is where does the basic liberal arts education fit in that? When you're training all of these kids and they're doing internships from the time they're sophomores in high school, how are they, and is it important that they learn art history or French literature or women's studies or whatever?
So when I ran for mayor, and I never ran for student council or class, I'm the only person running for president, I guarantee you, never had anything to do with student government in any way. And I'm not, if you were a class president, I mean, no disrespect, I just didn't hang out in those circles. And I couldn't believe that the mayor of Denver would never hang out with the superintendent of schools. Now, the superintendent of schools is appointed by the school board, separately elected, and the mayor deals with the city council. I understand, and I understood intellectually that the superintendent controlled the press around education. So if things went well, and the mayor invested himself and was openly supportive, if things went well, the superintendent would still get all the credit. He controls when the press conference is, he controls who speaks when. I get it. And if things go bad, the superintendent's got to make sure that the governor's right beside him, sharing the blame. So that's a big reason why in almost every city you rarely see the mayors collaborating with the superintendents and the school board. We did the opposite. I made a commitment that if I got elected, I would visit every school in Denver in my first 4 years. Now, unfortunately, no one pointed out to me there were 161 schools. So my first 4 years, I went and spent 2 hours every week in a school, and I can tell you firsthand, especially in sophomore, junior, and senior years, I've never seen more bored kids in my life. Right? If they're in AP class or they're out doing something important, they're engaged and they're working. When they're in these, social studies classes and these electives, they're biding time. They're just passing time. Think about it. I mean, I don't want to jump on the parade, but 20% of our kids never finish high school. Another 20% barely finish high school but never take another class. What does that say about our system? I mean, it should tell us that this is not working. 20% who don't finish high school know that it's one of the worst black marks they can get for getting a decent job and having a decent career, and yet somehow this seems to be okay with us. I think the kids that are bored silly and so bored they drop out that school doesn't work for them, they're not stupid. They just can't stand being in a room where people are talking at them about things they have no interest in. And again, we send the kids back for 3 days their sophomore year, 2 days their junior year. They're learning how to be citizens, they're learning how our government works, they're learning the basics of citizenship. But I think there's a clear point of no returns for many kids. And doesn't mean they're good kids or bad kids, smart kids, or kids just aren't interested. Let's give them a real shot at getting some skills and being able to have a real life. And it doesn't cost us any extra money. They get to choose what they want. Their parents are involved in it. They get money. The businesses are happy. There's a reason why it's being rolled out in all these other states.
So, I want to switch gears. We talked a little bit about mental health earlier. I want to talk about, physical health, but healthcare.
Sure.
So you disagree with the idea of Medicare for all, but you did bring up the topic earlier of universal
Healthcare
access.
is an alienable right, not a privilege.
So what's the role of the federal government in ensuring that everybody has access to it?
Sure. So, and I am a great believer in states' rights. I realize that's not common for a Democrat. Trust me, I get a lot of grief from my fellow Democrats about it. This might be one of the places where the federal government does have to take a larger role. But I don't believe in this country that we're going to succeed by going to the American people and telling them that they have to give up their private insurance. Right? 180 million people have private insurance. Most of it's through their place of business. Many of them are Democrats through their unions negotiated very generous healthcare insurance throughout their retirement. And now we're telling them you're going to have to give that up for something that probably almost certainly won't be as generous. Americans, again, I understand many people hate their private insurance and want something different, but we should have a public option. Maybe it's Medicare, maybe it's a form of Medicare Advantage. There are certain parts of Medicare Advantage, such as allowing telemedicine to be compensated, which I think is a big deal if you really want to improve rural healthcare and make sure that we don't lose rural hospitals and clinics. But whatever it is, let's call it the best practices of Medicare as a public option. So those people that can't get insurance on their exchange or aren't satisfied with it, they can, on a sliding scale, just like our proverbial community health centers, can migrate into this public option. And if Senator Sanders, and I have tremendous respect, Senator Sanders helped illuminate this issue and gave it the clarity that allowed it to come front and foremost. So I try never to criticize him. But if this public option does all that Senator Sanders and Senator Warren believe that a single payer would do, that Medicare would do, as it grows, it should come down in cost and improve in quality. So that would make it more attractive. More people would go to it. It would improve more people would go to it. Eventually, we could end up with Medicare for all, but it would be in 10 or 15 years, and it would be through evolution, not revolution. And I think that's a crucial difference. In Colorado, we got to near universal health care coverage. At the same time, we really got our arms around and began controlling. We had 3 consecutive years with 0 inflation of any kind in our Medicaid system. On a per patient basis, 0 inflation. Just by doing a full court press on trying to make sure everyone had a medical home and that everybody throughout the entire state was getting analyzed for the basic things like pre-existing conditions. So that's how I feel about Medicare for all. I think the more powerful question is how do we address inflation in healthcare, because it's, I know, almost 40 years now it's been rough justice, double the rate of inflation at the CPI. And we somehow have accepted that to the point by, next year they're saying it'll be 19% of our GDP. And the next closest industrialized country is, I think, Switzerland at 11%. Why is that? So, few quick observations. One, we need transparency in clinics and hospitals. If you're taking your kid to get a tonsillectomy, shouldn't you know what it's going to cost and what your copay is going to be? And shouldn't you be able to have some ranking of quality based on outcomes available to you? I mean, the hospitals consistently say it's too complicated. But Walmart can tell you the price of every single widget they sell, and they've got a lot of them. I think 140,000 last time I checked. Second thing, pharmaceuticals. How can we be paying on average 3 times more than any other country? And on certain miracle drugs, like modern insulin, we pay 30 times more in this country than they pay in Canada. Actually, a young woman in northern New Hampshire told me that, and she was so upset about it, she had the receipts to show it. And that's because decades ago, our Congress was so worried, and for various well-intentioned reasons, expanding healthcare, they were willing to give away to the pharmaceutical companies the right to negotiate at scale. And that's a huge part. We're the only country that is not allowed to take our Medicare program and negotiate much, much, much lower sales prices. And to a large extent, this and several other disparities have created the situation where Americans are almost single-handedly paying for the creation of all these miracle drugs. And then, of course, by paying those exorbitant rates, we don't get the benefit in the we pay more for the miracles we create. So that's the second thing. The third thing, which I think is the least talked about and probably the most important, is how do we get ourselves to stay healthy without coming in and saying, federal government tells you to do this. We all have a self-interest in this. So one is fee for service. We've created an industry. The industry only makes money if it provides a service. So every time they prescribe or suggest or recommend a blood test or a scan, X-ray, they make money. If you average it all out, rough justice, we do double the numbers of scans and tests of other industrial countries, and we have no better outcomes. We feel better because we think we're getting tested all the time, but by no measure do we have any better outcome than anyone can demonstrate. And perhaps more problematic is the fact that we don't compensate our healthcare system if someone stays healthy, right? If someone's got an inclination to overeat, they don't exercise, they get hypertension, more likely to have a heart attack. If the doctor convinces them to start bicycling and eat better, and that inclination goes away, there's no compensation for the doctor except the job well done, that self-satisfaction. However, if they do nothing and there's a heart attack, money rains down on the healthcare profession. And I'm not saying doctors are in any way immoral. I'm just saying you don't want to have systems in life where there are financial incentives for the opposite of what you want to have happen. In Colorado, one of the things we've done is we've provided incentives for our state employees. And we trust them on this, but if they stop smoking, if they exercise, if they change their diet, we reduce their copay and say, all right, you're saving us money, we'll save you money. And it's bribery. I'm not going to defend it on its purest sense, but it works. It's been very successful in motivating people to change their lifestyle, and I don't feel guilty or Machiavelli about it. It's trying to create healthier people. The other thing we've done is we've made outdoor recreation a huge partner in Colorado, and I think outdoor recreation should be a partner for every state and for the federal government. That here's a industry, and this I include biking and hiking and skiing and hunting and angling. I mean, outdoor recreation in 2017 was $887 billion industry in this country, and most of the people that make those little widgets on a backpack or on a bicycle, they don't want to be in cities. They like to have smaller manufacturing facilities, mostly in rural areas. Most of us good governors kill ourselves trying to find more businesses that will locate there. The outdoor recreation ends up being in cities and suburbs just because that seems to be where they get more employees. We can. They're another classic example of a place where they want to create jobs at the place where we most want to create jobs, as governors, and they are creating a lifestyle change that gets, especially with young people, we can get their face out of their cell phone and get them active again. We know that they're going to have changes in lifestyle, and I think the president should be at the top and center of that. We should revitalize the president's physical fitness council. I don't know, are you old enough to remember that thing where they made us do calisthenics and sit-ups and everything in school was such a pain in the neck? How bad an idea was it, right? If you look at it now.
Hated it.
Yeah, exactly. How bad an idea was it?
Governor, they're about to wrap up, so
Okay.
I want to make sure, there's a couple of lightning quick questions you want to do.
Well, go ahead.
Keep the
How about
answers real short.
immigration? So,
Sure.
At this very moment, there may not be a more charged or contentious issue than immigration, and it's not exclusive to our border areas. Is it reasonable, realistic to think that there's a sensible or practical middle ground that can be achieved here? And if there is, what does it look like?
Absolutely, and I think we are at a unique point. We have rough justice 7.5 million jobs that are unfilled, and I think 6.3 or 6.4 million people looking. It's the first time in my lifetime we've ever seen it upside down like that, where there are not as many people looking as there are jobs. It's a perfect time to address this. So I would say first, deal with the humanitarian crisis on the border. This isn't a country where we should sanction government employees taking children from their parents and putting them in cages, in any sense. The fact that some of them were put up for adoption, I find frightening. Second thing, we cut back, and even the last couple of years, I believe, began to reduce the amount of funding we put into the Northern Triangle countries. And those countries are essentially the source of so many of the refugees coming to the southern border now, and especially since Trump cut off all funding, they've become war zones. So people are literally fleeing for their lives. We're going to spend much more on the border crisis than we would have if we just invested the money into those countries. So that's the second thing we should do. And then the third thing we do is actually finally get comprehensive immigration reform, which when I first ran for mayor in 2003 was unheard of. And I mean, we said the same thing, that it was heard of, but we couldn't get any compromise for a variety of reasons. But here's my 4-point proposal. Secure the border. You don't need a wall. Second, have an ID system that works. And now since 9/11, we do have an ID system that works. Every state has a driver's license. It's almost impossible to counterfeit. Third, or have an ID system. Give everyone who's here, 10 million, 11 million people. I mean, we don't have enough workers now. We're not. If we were to deport these workers, it would cause a recession without question, and perhaps worse. Give everyone 10-year visa. They can have extension if things don't work out. They're here illegally, and I think it's fair to say that they should be punishment for that they should have to wait longer before they can apply for citizenship. But I think we can't, and I think we can get Republican chambers of commerce across this country to come out and support this. And then, last of all, I think we have to hold businesses accountable, right? We would not have the immigration problem if businesses weren't paying people under the table. And you need to increase the penalty to a level where people stop paying people under the table. When I ran for re-election in 2014, I met a guy who owned a sheetrock company, another guy owned a commercial painting company. They'd lost their businesses because they wouldn't cheat. And they'd had their businesses, both of them, for over 20 years, and they went out of business.
Quick lightning question here. TPP and USMCA on trade, do you support those plans?
You can't do TTP in a quick lightning round. I don't think it was, well, it's too,
Fair enough.
it's too important. I don't think it was where it needed to be, and I think we could have negotiated harder for it. My doctrine, and I think, being commander-in-chief is probably the most important aspect of being president. I call it constant engagement. We need the opposite of this isolationism that Trump is preaching and that many of the Democrats are preaching. It's not just about international security and all these strategic alliances. So we started with NATO, now we have 25 different strategic alliances. We need to be negotiating with countries all the time because climate change, what we do in this country is best practices, but we will not succeed if we can't get the whole world to work with us. Public health pandemics like Ebola, so many people flying everywhere. These things could spread so fast if we don't have instant, close, trusted relationships with other governments. Cybersecurity, we have no protocols. I mean, I go down the list. We need constant engagement. Doesn't mean that you, it does not mean that you let a country like China, when you know they're cheating on international agreements, you know that they are stealing intellectual property, there have got to be consequences. But a tariff war is the single worst thing we can do. Again, talking to all these big economists, no one has been able to tell me of one single historical example where there's a winner from a tariff war, where anyone comes out better. Every single time you have a tariff war, both sides end up worse. So why would we possibly do it? I think what we needed was some version of TDP so that we are able to use our alliances and the global economic fabric to hold those businesses, those countries, those road countries like China accountable. And we were getting there. We were not there, but we were slowly bringing them to being a willing participant in improvements. Now we run away from TTP. The other allies use it, but now they're all cutting their own deals with China left and right, and we've lost that ability to step in and really change China's behavior. We could not have picked a worse course of action.
Election security, how concerned are you?
Very concerned. I think part of cybersecurity is you've got to recognize the biggest threats we've got. Colorado, we have an all-mail ballot, so we're up at close to 75% participation, no fraudulent. We have paper backup for every ballot. People can go vote on election day if they want to, and it costs 20% less. So that we have a system in Colorado, and there are about a half dozen states that are a model for how we can have safe, secure elections. But we got to get on it, and the federal government should provide those choices to states.
Go.
Well, that's what, well, I guess of all
I've got all the time in the world, so you guys are talking. I'm ready.
This one. As I promised to Aaron that we would
Oh,
ask about.
well, we did promise you a marijuana question, so you're gonna.
That can't be a lightning round.
Well,
I can do it in 3
No,
minutes.
it doesn't have to be like
yeah,
that,
yeah.
but
But
it,
kinda,
but I
yeah,
think
where
it will be our
because I, mean, I know that from what I've read at least, you were very much in favor of decriminalization. And of medicinal marijuana, but when you were governor, the state was moving really fast. So, kind of how where are you at now in terms of recreational marijuana? What do you think? What do you think has worked? What hasn't? And what would work at the national level?
So I opposed it, the legalization of recreational marijuana, because I was worried that we'd see a spike in teenage consumption. I mentioned to you that we have this 24,000 person survey we do every 2 years, which is so powerful. And again, we've seen no spike in teenage consumption, no spike in people driving while high. Still not a perfect situation. We have some black market. We haven't gotten rid of all the black market yet. I'm not sure I agree that we need such a high level of THC. I'm not sure what that does, except increase the probability that people will have very, very bad experiences and end up in an emergency room. But we should recognize two things. One, the old system was a train wreck. We sent hundreds of thousands, millions of kids to prison, made them felons, in many cases made very difficult lives incomparably more difficult. Second, last year, rough justice, 40,000 people died of the medical consequences of alcohol. Nobody, to my knowledge, died of the medical consequences of marijuana. Not to say that there aren't some young people especially who have a predisposition or an inclination and can become, their bipolar can become almost schizophrenic and can become schizophrenic, many scientists believe, based on marijuana. But I look at it now, I don't think the federal government should go and tell states who should legalize and who shouldn't. I think states are the laboratories of democracy. I think the federal government should decriminalize it on a federal basis. I think they should decertify it as a class 1 narcotic, so finally we can do medical research. We know that it works on certain types of seizures, certain types of autism. Let's let the FDA measure like any other drug and see if there are any unintended side effects or unintended negative consequences. Let's treat it like a drug if that's what it is, which it clearly is. And then let's get the Department of Agriculture and make sure we're not using the wrong pesticides. And most importantly, let's let banks bank marijuana business, which now they can't, even in medical marijuana states, you can't write checks, you can't use charge cards unless you're lucky enough to find a rogue, bank somewhere. You can't bank it. If you wanted to ensure that an industry was corrupt and full of gangsters, how would you do that? Let's see. Maybe the first thing would be to make sure it's all cash, right? So anyway, that's my. I don't think the federal government should tell each one who should legalize it, but I think each state who wants to should have the ability to legalize it, which is essentially what we did with alcohol. You can drive from Denver down to Dallas, and you'll drive right through dry counties in Oklahoma and Texas.
So you went through this several years ago. You get some hindsight now, although it's still evolving.
Yeah.
New Hampshire is now at that point of, do we do this, do we not do that? What would you recommend?
I would recommend that any state engaging in legalizing recreational marijuana do it in a very thoughtful way and make sure that you get good baselines and you measure. I don't like government having a self-interest by promoting something that's inherently unhealthy. Again, I support legalizing marijuana now, but it's just like alcohol, it's something that people want and are going to use, and I don't think we should make it illegal, but I don't think we should make our government dependent upon those taxes. So as a state legalizes it, what we did in Colorado is try to make sure that all the tax revenue is used for I think about 40% is for education, maybe it's 50% now. And then the rest is we try to use for the unintended consequences of drug use. So wraparound services for people that have addictions, housing for chronic homeless people that have addictions. Some of these things that are really hard to fund otherwise. I think marijuana is the appropriate tax generation to address some of those.
All right. Well, we appreciate you taking the time to.
No, of course. I'm
To
sorry,
swing over
my
here.
answers are so long, but I feel that it's so many of these programs I'm so frustrated in the campaign again and again, hearing simple answers to all these things, generally by people that have never implemented a complex policy.